HOA called 911 and broke into my Lakeside ranch at 2 a.m. But my son was a trained archery shooter. You ever have one of those nights where everything's peaceful, and then out of nowhere, everything goes straight to chaos? That was my 2 a.m. Quiet lake, stars out, family asleep, and then red and blue lights flashing across the water. The HOA called 911, broke into my Lakeside ranch, and had no idea my teenage son had been training in archery for years. What happened next? Let's just say they should have knocked first. It was one of those perfect, silent nights you get once in a while living by the lake. The kind of night where the only sounds are the chirping crickets and the gentle lapping of water against the dock. My wife was asleep beside me, my dog curled up at our feet, and my son, Ethan, had stayed up a little late reading in his room across the hall. Everything was calm, peaceful, the kind of calm that city folks dream about and never find, the kind of night you move out here for. But then, just past 2 a.m., that peace shattered like a rock through glass. I woke up suddenly to the sound of banging. Not knocking, banging, as if someone was kicking the back door or maybe slamming a flashlight against it. For a second, I thought it might be a bear again. We'd had issues with one a few weeks back digging through trash. But no, this wasn't wildlife. This was forceful, human. I sat up, heart pounding, listening closely. The dog was already on alert, growling low and steady. Then came the flashlights. Long beams of light sweeping across our porch and windows, shadows jerking across the wall as figures moved outside. I grabbed my phone, no texts, no missed calls, no alerts from the security camera app. I flipped to the live feed from the back camera. Took a second to load, but when it did, my blood ran cold. 3 people were out there, 2 in what looked like tactical gear, the third holding a clipboard. One of them appeared to be on a phone. Then another loud thud hit the back door, and I could hear someone shout, "Open up! This is emergency enforcement." I jumped out of bed and rushed down the hall to Ethan's room. He was already up, wide-eyed, holding the edge of his window curtain open just a crack. "Dad, there's people with flashlights. They're at the barn too." I motioned for him to stay calm, but I could see his hands shaking a little. That's when I heard another noise, glass. I didn't know if it was a window or maybe the back door being breached, but it wasn't subtle. Someone had just broken in. Ethan backed away from the window. I turned and grabbed my old service flashlight from the cabinet drawer near the kitchen. Not a weapon, but sturdy and bright enough to blind someone up close. My wife came rushing down the hallway now, clearly shaken. "What's going on?" she asked, voice cracking. I told her to stay put in the hallway and take the dog. Just then, I saw Ethan standing at the corner, holding something in his hand. Took me a second to recognize it. His compound bow. Lightweight, tactical graphite string. The one he'd trained with for months at the local archery range. The one he kept in pristine condition. He didn't say a word. Just knocked an arrow and held it low, not drawn, but ready. I didn't know whether to be terrified or proud. Part of me wanted to take it away from him. The other part trusted him more than whoever was out there breaking into my home. Another bang, this time from the side door. Then came the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Inside. Heavy boots on wooden floorboards. We were being invaded, and I had no idea why. I edged around the corner, shining my flashlight toward the hallway. "I'm armed," I shouted. "This is private property. I've called the police." It was a bluff. I hadn't had time to dial, but someone outside answered back. "This is the HOA with emergency authorization. You're harboring unregistered structures and violating code 8.3.3. What the hell did that even mean? Emergency authorization? At 2 a.m.? Breaking into my home? That's when Ethan stepped beside me. Calm. Breathing steady. Bow still low. "Should I draw?" he whispered. I told him no for now. The flashlight beam caught the edge of a figure just past the laundry room. A man in a vest, holding a radio, was walking slowly into our kitchen like he owned the place. He froze when the light hit him. He looked startled, maybe even confused. "You're not supposed to be here," he said, almost like we were the trespassers. Ethan shifted behind me, and I could feel the tension in the room rise like a storm front. The man raised one hand like he was trying to calm things, but his other hand was still on his belt, resting near what looked like a baton. I heard more footsteps now, at least 2 more coming in from the front door. My dog barked wildly from the hallway. My wife was crying quietly, trying to hush the dog. The house was now fully surrounded and invaded by people claiming to be acting on behalf of the HOA. The tension in the room was suffocating as the man in the vest stood frozen in our kitchen, caught in the harsh white beam of my flashlight. His eyes flickered between me and Ethan, who still stood silently behind me with his compound bow held low but ready. From the other end of the house, I could hear heavy boots stomping through the front hallway, voices murmuring back and forth in what sounded like walkie-talkie codes. These weren't just trespassers, they were organized. But they weren't police either. No uniforms, no badges, just civilian clothes mixed with high-visibility vests and clipboards. One of them stepped into the living room and shined a flashlight directly in my face. "Sir, we need you to stand down. This property is under review by the HOA for violations. You've been notified." His voice was flat, authoritative, like someone reading lines from a manual. I lowered the flashlight slightly to avoid blinding myself, but I didn't budge from my spot. "You broke into my home," I said, my voice steady, though my heart was racing. "This is trespassing. You have no warrant, no police with you. What the hell do you think you're doing?" The first guy in the vest waved the other one over and whispered something. That second man stepped forward and pulled out a folded packet of papers from his jacket. He held it out, but not in a way that allowed me to actually read it, just enough to flash it like a prop. "This is an emergency code enforcement from the HOA. You've constructed unauthorized structures on protected land within the association's boundaries. The board has determined this to be a public hazard." I stared at him, baffled. Protected land? Hazard? The barn on our property had been standing for decades. It was inspected and approved before we bought the place. Nothing had been changed or added in years. I tried to process the absurdity. These people weren't police, yet they were acting like a SWAT team. They'd smashed our back door, entered without consent, and now they were trying to accuse us of zoning violations in the middle of the night. I glanced toward the hallway, where my wife was still clutching our barking dog. Ethan hadn't moved an inch. His face was unreadable, focused, watching every move they made. The man with the papers stepped further into the living room, gesturing vaguely toward the window that overlooked our detached garage and lakeside shed. "Your outbuilding has been flagged. Satellite imagery shows unregistered expansion. You were supposed to submit new plans to the HOA by April. That did not happen. As per Section 8.3.3 of the HOA Codebook, emergency action may be taken to neutralize unapproved construction that poses a safety threat to the community." The way he said neutralize sent a chill down my spine. This wasn't how HOA disputes were handled. This wasn't a letter in the mailbox or a fine on the door. This was an armed invasion dressed in paperwork and self-importance. I asked again to see a warrant or any kind of law enforcement order. They offered none. "We are in contact with the sheriff's office," one of them said. "They've been notified and will be arriving shortly to assist with the removal of non-compliant structures." I almost laughed. The sheriff's office out here was a 2-person department covering hundreds of square miles. There was no way they'd greenlight this nonsense at 2 a.m., especially not with my clean record and long-standing property rights. Then came the kicker. The guy with the clipboard tapped something into his phone and turned the screen toward me. "Your neighbor, Mr. Donnelly, filed a report. Claimed you've been building illegal cabins and storing hazardous materials by the waterline. We investigated and confirmed the complaint." I stared at the phone screen, which showed nothing but grainy images, probably Google Maps screenshots taken from years ago. Mr. Donnelly was a known busybody, a retiree who'd called the HOA over kids playing music too loud during a barbecue last summer. He hated that we had a better dock than his. "You investigated? When? Who approved this?" I demanded. They offered no answers, just vague responses about emergency clauses and executive decisions from the HOA board. Ethan took a step forward, his bow still steady in his hands. "You can't just come in our house and lie," he said, his voice sharp but calm. That made one of the men pause. The guy in the vest looked uneasy now, glancing at the bow, realizing maybe this wasn't going to be the easy intimidation tactic they had planned. My wife finally emerged from the hallway, trembling but furious. "You scared our family in the middle of the night because of a shed?" she said, her voice cracking from emotion and anger. They didn't answer her. They just began taking photos of our walls, windows, and doors with their phones, muttering to each other about documentation. One of them even walked toward the hallway as if inspecting the floor plan, completely ignoring the fact that they were in a private home, uninvited, with no police backing and no real legal standing. Ethan stood motionless in the center of the living room, one foot slightly behind the other, shoulders squared, eyes locked on the intruders who were now pacing through our home like inspectors on a demolition mission. His compound bow was angled slightly down, but his fingers rested loosely around the knock of the arrow, like he'd been trained to do. He didn't say anything, and I didn't need him to. The moment I looked at him, I knew he was in his zone. Years of archery training had taught him not just accuracy, but focus, restraint, and control under pressure. He'd competed in local tournaments, practiced in the woods behind our property, and had become known for his calm under fire. One of the HOA agents, if you could even call them that, took notice of Ethan and froze mid-step when he saw the bow. "Is that a weapon?" he asked, voice rising slightly. Ethan didn't answer, but I spoke up for him. "It's a bow. My son trains in competitive archery. He has every right to carry it inside his own home, especially when people start breaking in unannounced at 2 in the morning." The man's eyes darted between me and Ethan, clearly unsure of what to say next. He took a small step back, probably calculating the distance between himself and the nearest exit. Another one of the intruders chimed in, trying to regain control of the situation. "You're escalating things by arming a minor," he said, trying to sound official, but it came off as nervous. "That bow is a threat." I stepped forward. "No, you are the threat. You broke into our home with no badge, no warrant, and no authority. My son's bow is not the problem. The fact that you're trespassing is." Ethan remained silent. He was trained not to speak unless absolutely necessary, especially when dealing with pressure. I watched his breathing, slow, even controlled. The bow remained steady in his grip, a visual reminder to them that we weren't just going to stand there and take their abuse. One of the men tried to get brave and stepped closer toward Ethan, hands raised slightly like he was talking down someone with a gun. "Son, I'm going to need you to put that down. It's not safe, and we're just here to do our job." Ethan finally spoke, his voice calm but cold. "Your job doesn't involve breaking into homes and scaring families. You shouldn't be here." The man looked taken aback by how steady and unapologetic he sounded. It was clear he expected fear, hesitation, maybe even tears. But he was met with a young man who had spent countless hours training his mind and body to react exactly like this. While the rest of the house remained tense, the presence of that bow changed everything. The HOA people began slowing down their movements, whispering instead of barking orders, hesitating before entering the next room. They kept glancing over their shoulders at Ethan like he was some sort of unpredictable wild card. He wasn't threatening them outright, he hadn't drawn the bowstring once, but the implication was clear. If things got worse, we were not unprepared. I could feel the shift in the room. The false confidence the intruders had when they came charging in was now thinning out. One of the clipboard guys even moved to the corner, pulled out his phone, and began making a call in hushed tones. Another stood by the window, trying to look like he was still inspecting something but clearly just distancing himself from Ethan. The entire room now revolved around the teenager with the bow. Not because he was dangerous, but because he wasn't intimidated. My wife stepped behind Ethan now, hand on his shoulder. She wasn't trying to stop him. She was standing with him. That gesture alone made the trespassers even more uneasy. They expected panic. Instead, they got unity. I stood to the side, watching my son maintain a level of discipline most adults would struggle with in this kind of situation. He didn't waver, didn't flinch, and didn't give in to the urge to argue. He just stood there, the quiet center of the storm, making it impossible for them to continue acting like they were in control. One of them finally muttered something about needing to reassess the perimeter and stepped outside. Another followed, pretending to take more photos of the deck but really just looking for an excuse to get away from the standoff. Slowly, the house began to empty. The people who had so confidently forced their way in were now realizing that they weren't dealing with a helpless family. They were dealing with a trained kid who knew how to hold his ground, and a father who wasn't going to let this slide. The only thing more unsettling to them than a family united was one that knew the law, knew its rights, and knew how to defend itself without ever raising a voice or firing a shot. The flashing lights outside started to reflect off the lake as the unmistakable sound of police sirens broke through the tension-filled air. For a brief second, I felt a strange kind of relief. Surely the arrival of real law enforcement would put an end to this madness. But I also couldn't shake the worry that the HOA had fed them some twisted version of events. We stayed where we were. Ethan standing firm with his bow, my wife behind him with one hand on his shoulder, and me in the living room with the flashlight still in my hand, now lowered but tight in my grip. The HOA intruders suddenly perked up. One of them rushed to the front door and opened it halfway, waving a hand outside. "We've got the homeowner secured. Potential threats have been de-escalated," he shouted, completely misrepresenting the situation. I could see the silhouettes of two uniformed officers stepping cautiously onto the porch, hands resting near their holsters. I held my breath. This could go either way. The sheriff's deputies entered with the kind of deliberate calm that comes from years of handling unpredictable situations. The taller one, with silver hair and a badge that read Reynolds, scanned the room with sharp eyes, quickly clocking Ethan's bow, the busted door, and the clipboard guy pretending to act like everything was under control. The second officer, younger and more rigid, stepped in behind him, his hand hovering near his belt. "What's going on here?" Officer Reynolds asked, his voice low and firm. The man in the vest, still holding his radio like a prop, stepped forward and launched into a rehearsed spiel. Sheriff's office was notified due to a code violation emergency under HOA Clause 8.3.3. We have photographic evidence of non-compliant structures and received a report from a neighboring property owner about unauthorized dwellings and potential hazardous activity. He motioned vaguely to the window overlooking the shed near the water. "We've been in contact with the HOA board, and under the emergency authority granted." Officer Reynolds raised a hand, cutting him off. "I didn't ask for your HOA handbook. I asked what the hell is going on inside this family's home at 2 in the morning. His tone sharpened instantly. The room fell quiet. The HOA reps suddenly lost their swagger. The younger deputy stepped forward now, noting the broken door, scattered paperwork, and our family's defensive posture. He looked at Ethan, then me. "Sir, were you aware these individuals were entering your home tonight?" "No," I said firmly. "They broke in. They didn't knock. They didn't present anything official. They just started walking through our house, claiming we built illegal structures and saying they had emergency authority from the HOA. We don't even have a single violation notice on file." Ethan remained quiet, his bow still in hand but clearly not drawn or pointed. Reynolds looked him over with a practiced eye and gave a subtle nod, not of approval necessarily, but understanding. The man with the clipboard tried to interject again. "We've been given legal standing under the HOA charter. We are acting within our rights." Officer Reynolds turned on him, stepping closer. "You don't have the right to enter someone's home without permission. You don't have the right to break in, damage property, and certainly not in the middle of the night. If there were legitimate concerns, you go through the proper channels. You contact the sheriff's office and request a civil order, not stage a paramilitary home invasion with flashlights and clipboards." The room fell still. The HOA reps were clearly not expecting pushback from law enforcement. Their confidence unraveled quickly. I could see one of them sweating, his hand nervously playing with the edge of his paperwork. Officer Reynolds turned to me again. "Did you or your son threaten them in any way?" I shook my head. "We told them to leave." Ethan didn't draw his bow. He was just ready in case someone tried to hurt us. The younger officer moved toward the broken door, taking photos with his phone. "You'll want to file a formal report," he said. This is criminal trespass at the very least. And that damage to the door? That's breaking and entering. My wife stepped forward now, still trembling but speaking clearly. They were taking photos of our family. They walked into my kitchen. One of them tried to go down the hall to my son's room. Reynolds' jaw tightened. He turned back to the HOA board members, who now looked far less in control. Everyone outside. Now, we're going to have a little talk about where your authority ends and where the law begins. The clipboard guy started to speak again, but Reynolds shut him down with a glare. I said outside. One by one, they filed out of the house, their fake authority crumbling with every step. The atmosphere outside shifted the moment the HOA group was ordered off the property by Officer Reynolds. Their earlier smugness had all but vanished, replaced by defensive body language and quick, hushed whispers among themselves. You could tell they were beginning to realize they'd crossed a serious line. They stood near the sheriff's cruiser at the edge of our driveway, talking among themselves as if they were planning their next excuse. But nothing they could say now would undo the fact that they had broken into someone's home based on a flimsy neighbor complaint and some made-up interpretation of HOA policy. As I stood beside Officer Reynolds while he jotted down preliminary notes, one of the board members, the same guy who had flashed that ridiculous clipboard earlier, started trying to shift the blame. He pointed toward the lake, toward Mr. Donnelly's house barely visible in the dark. We were acting on a legitimate report. Mr. Donnelly claimed this family had set up multiple illegal outbuildings. He sent us photos, GPS coordinates, and said they were harboring potentially hazardous items near a shared drainage path. Reynolds raised an eyebrow but didn't look impressed. And you didn't think to confirm any of that with my office before you kicked in someone's door? The board member, clearly rattled, stammered. We assumed urgency was required. We were told the property might pose a risk to community safety. His phrasing shifted subtly, indicating that he was now trying to pin the decision on someone else. The board chair reviewed the complaint and approved immediate on-site action. Ethan and my wife stood back near the porch steps, listening quietly. I could see the way her arms were folded, how she kept glancing back at our broken door, as if still trying to process that all of this actually happened. It wasn't over some big criminal event or major emergency. It was over a shed we had permission to build. A shed that had been there for 2 years without a single formal complaint or violation notice. But apparently to a man like Mr. Donnelly, who'd made a habit out of nitpicking every neighbor's lawn height, fence color, and noise level. A shed with a slightly longer roof was enough to call the HOA to war. Officer Reynolds looked around, taking everything in. The shattered wood near the doorframe, the flashlight still lying on the porch, the bowed but unbroken faces of a family that had just endured something most people never would. I'm going to need to speak with Mr. Donnelly myself, he said at last. This doesn't sound like a neighborhood concern. This sounds like a personal vendetta disguised as a code violation. He scribbled a few more things down in his notebook and turned toward me. Do you know if you've had any disputes with him lately? Anything that might have triggered this? I nodded. A couple of weeks ago, he came by complaining that our dock was blocking his view of the lake. He also didn't like that Ethan was practicing archery outside, even though we have a safe range set up with a full backstop. He said it made him nervous. We've never once had an arrow leave our land. Reynolds let out a dry sigh. So you've got a grumpy neighbor with too much time on his hands and an HOA board that doesn't know how to follow the law. He snapped his notebook closed. Classic combo. Meanwhile, the HOA members started to realize their legal ground was shrinking fast. The woman who had been mostly quiet during the confrontation stepped forward now, trying to sound reasonable. We didn't mean to frighten anyone. It was just supposed to be a routine inspection. The board was under the impression that Reynolds cut her off with a raised hand. If the board thinks breaking and entering is part of a routine inspection, you've got much bigger problems than unpermitted sheds. I could tell they were shifting into damage control mode. No more loud commands, no more waving papers like they were warrants. Now it was all downplayed tones and vague references to miscommunication. But the damage was already done. The sheriff had seen it firsthand. My wife had broken into tears once she realized the deputies were on our side. Ethan, still holding his bow at his side, finally let it rest against the porch railing. One of the deputies walked up to the group of HOA members and asked for their names and identification. When one of them hesitated, Reynolds spoke up again. "I suggest you cooperate. Otherwise, we can always make this official with charges and handcuffs." That sobered them up fast. They pulled out wallets and badges, HOA-issued ID cards that looked more like something a mall security guard would use than actual authority. The younger deputy began taking photos of each of them with his phone, documenting the scene, the broken door, and the exact location of the supposed violations they had stormed in to inspect. It became more and more obvious with each passing minute that these people had acted recklessly, all based on a neighbor's personal grudge. There was no emergency, no hazard, no code that gave them the right to enter someone's home, especially not in the middle of the night. As Officer Reynolds continued his quiet conversation with the deputy near the cruiser, the HOA members stood awkwardly to the side, now fully aware that their plan had completely unraveled. Gone were the bold declarations and smug threats from earlier. They had gone from self-declared authority figures to suspects under investigation within the span of an hour. And now it was clear they were being pressed for more than just an apology. Reynolds wasn't letting them off with a warning. He wanted documentation, paper trails, and most of all, answers. He walked back toward me, flipping through his notebook with a look that said he wasn't impressed with anything he'd heard so far. "I've asked them twice now to produce the actual HOA documentation that supposedly gave them the right to conduct this kind of late-night enforcement. All I've gotten so far are vague references to internal board minutes, an unsigned notice template, and some printouts from Google Maps." He paused, locking eyes with me. "They don't have anything." I wasn't surprised. Most HOAs had rules, sure, some of them overly specific or downright ridiculous. But even the most tightly run associations couldn't hand themselves authority to break into homes in the dead of night. Whatever clause they were leaning on, it was either grossly misinterpreted or completely fabricated. The real kicker was that they believed a sheet of paper and a clipboard would be enough to bulldoze their way through my home. Ethan had gone inside by then, placing his bow carefully back into its case, his body finally relaxing now that the immediate threat was gone. My wife followed him, her hands still trembling, her mind trying to make sense of everything that had just happened. I stayed outside, needing to see the whole thing through. Reynolds turned back to the group of HOA members and asked again, slowly this time, "Who on your board authorized this action?" They glanced at each other, silent. No one answered. The deputy stepped in. "Let me rephrase. Which individual gave the green light to come onto this property, in the middle of the night, with no law enforcement present, and forcibly enter a home?" It was the kind of question you couldn't sidestep without sounding guilty. The woman who had tried to sound reasonable earlier finally spoke up. It was Chairman Ellis. He said we had the right to inspect structures and investigate safety concerns under subsection 8.3.3. Reynolds scribbled that name into his pad. "Where is he now?" She fumbled for her phone. "He's not on site. He was going to meet us later in the morning to review findings." Couldn't help but scoff. So the person behind all this, Chairman Ellis, wasn't even present. He had sent these people into someone's home while he stayed warm in bed, assuming his status gave him power to bypass every legal boundary that existed. That was the kind of arrogance that HOA horror stories were made of. Reynolds nodded. "All right, I'm filing this as a criminal trespass and possible unlawful entry. I'm going to need access to your HOA's bylaws, including all board meeting minutes from the last 6 months, and a full copy of the enforcement procedures you're allegedly following." The clipboard guy, now visibly sweating, tried to salvage what little pride he had left. "This is a misunderstanding. We were just trying to ensure community standards were upheld. There's been talk of people building sheds without permits, using lake water improperly." Reynolds raised his hand again, cutting him off. "I don't care what kind of gossip floats around your board meetings. None of that justifies what I've seen here tonight. You had no legal standing, no court order. You entered a private home using force, and now you're trying to play clean up after realizing just how badly you screwed up." He turned to the deputy. "Take photos of every bit of damage, doorframe, porch, Interior, document everything. Then back to me, you'll get a case number before we leave. File a formal complaint. If you want to pursue civil charges or press for a restraining order, this documentation will support it. I nodded, not because I wanted to sue anyone, but because I wasn't going to let them get away with it. They had crossed a line, not just into my property, but into my family's safety, our trust, our peace of mind. As the deputies went around snapping photos, the HOA group slowly began making their way toward their vehicles. One by one, none of them saying a word. No apologies. No explanations. Just silence and shame. And perhaps, somewhere buried beneath that silence, the slow realization that power doesn't come from clipboards, highlighters, or title cards. It comes from law, from truth, and from respect for other people's boundaries. And tonight they had disrespected every one of them.